back to the Revolution of 1896, 1898, as well as the Commonwealth period, that's the 1930s, the presidential system established upon independence, post-war pre-martial law. As Bill mentioned, the system that was abolished with martial law in 1972 and then restored in 1986. And even this restored presidentialism, which I'm going to focus on, has been the longest standing, and technically also in the sense of what Marie said about East Timor, despite a number of crises, I'm going to be talking about a system which never actually has fully broken down, although it's experienced a number of difficulties. So, and let me also say that this paper draws on two research projects I'm involved in, one on the post-Marcos presidency with my colleague Jolai Tihanki, and the second, a study funded by a Hong Kong grant of comparative democracy and democratization in Southeast Asia, which I'm working on with Bill Case, and therefore you'll notice that there's some of the arguments I'll be making here in the comparative context that are similar to what he was saying. To give you just a brief overview, there have been 5 post-Marcos presidencies. Aquino's term, Noy Aquino, that is. It's confusing. When you say Aquino, you don't know which Aquino you're referring to. The dynasty, Aquino dynasty, has had 3 major politicians, 2 of them presidents, Cory and her son, Noy, and of course, Noy's father, Ninoy, was the famous martyr who helped launch the People Power Uprising. Cory Aquino faced a great deal of instability during her presidency, but given the fact that this was largely due to the constellation of the Marcos forces still trying to take power, and some of her allies, particularly in the Reform the Armed Forces movement, not happy that she was actually consolidating power for herself, trying to overthrow her, I'm going to skip over that case, although they'd be happy to talk about it if their interest. I will focus instead on Joseph Estrada, who was overthrown in 2001. By a middle-class protest movement, and Gloria Macapagal Arroyo, who barely survived in office until she left office in 2010, only to be imprisoned. Of those 5 presidents, only 2 have experienced relatively stable presidencies. That's Fidel Ramos in the 90s, and the current president, Noy Aquino. Despite some protests, despite some concern about corruption, his presidency, I think, can be described as relatively stable. Just to remind you of some of the arguments most famously made by Juan Linz when he talked about the perils of presidency. He talked about the problems of a divided political system with the executive and the legislature both competing for power and claiming democratic legitimacy, so who's right when they're in conflict, zero-sum conflicts leading to instability, particularly given the inflexibility of systems in which presidents have a fixed term and are rather difficult to remove constitutionally, even if they become quite unpopular. This seems to fit the Estrada overthrow. There was an attempt to remove him constitutionally. When that failed, he was actually overthrown in a peaceful uprising supported by the military, actually, and also, even though she survived the instability of the Arroyo administration. But I'm going to argue that the power struggle was less between the legislature and the executive, as patronage tends to secure legislative loyalty. Rather, it's disgruntled, non-electoral strategic elites who become insurrectionists, and that's also what we have seen happening recently in parliamentary Thailand. Okay, let me talk briefly about Estrada. Movie star populist, famously promised to be the friend of the friendless poor, era para sa mahirap, loved by the masa, the masses of the poor, masses of Philippine society, easily elected in 1998, and even though he was jailed for corruption after he was overthrown, he then ran again in 2010, and actually came in second with very little machinery. He remains a very popular politician to this day, still hated by the middle class and elites. He was overthrown in this so-called Second People Power Uprising at Santos. He was impeached by the House, but the Senate would not convict him. Therefore, the middle class and elite masses went to the street to overthrow him. This was basically an elite conspiracy disguised as people power. It was actually a people power coup. Gloria Macapagal Arroyo succeeded Estrada, remarkably unpopular at the outset, of course, particularly given the extra-constitutional nature of Estrada's overthrow and the fact that he was still loved by the masa. She was actually nearly overthrown just after assuming power when Estrada was arrested. There were a couple of days of massive protests and only intervention and the deaths of several protesters, and quite a repressive move by her government allowed her to survive. Then she went against her word, ran for election in 2004, which she could because she came into power in the midterm of Estrada. Re-election is forbidden in the Philippines, but this is a way she could get around it. She faced another populist movie star politician. This was Fernando Poe Jr., FPJ, who was a close friend of Estrada's. She won that election, supposedly. It was even, I remember, at a EuroSEAS conference where there was a discussion of his victory, her victory, but actually it turned out to be due to electoral fraud. The middle class tended to ignore this initially, even though reports were mounting, until actually there was a tape recording in which she more or less admitted herself that she had cheated FPJ by 1 million votes. This then led to strong civil societal protests against her, a number of major opposition groups, but through a generous use of patronage, even bribes, to the military brass and to the church hierarchy, she was able to survive in office, although one result was she was actually jailed, and that's been quite popular in the Philippines ever since she left office. But is this due to a perilous presidency? One argument has been made in a monograph that's been written about Estrada's overthrow by Hugo Tsuya, that actually Estrada lost control of the legislature and that led him to be impeached. I would add, however, true that though that is, he actually survived in the Senate. So it wasn't actually that the legislature turned against him fully, it was ultimately, of course, the elites that had turned against him. A unitary political system, as you have in parliamentary Thailand, did not provide political stability. On the other hand, in a divided presidential system, somewhat similar to the Philippines, as in Indonesia, you've had, as Bill talked about, we'll hear more in the second session, relative stability. Therefore, I want to talk a little bit, as Bill did at the end of his talk, about the behavior of what I call strategic groups, and underlying that structural conflicts, particularly class tensions in the cases of political instability. So let me turn to Thailand briefly, because this is a parliamentary system. We can't make this kind of institutional argument. And if you think about it, so Thaksin has complete control over parliament, control that was already quite strong in 2001, but by 2005, he had really very little opposition. So according to that kind of institutional argument, you shouldn't face many difficulties, and yet what occurs, as we know, the military coup of 2006, actually I would add the coup, another coup to that, 2008, although it wasn't officially a military coup, but indirectly so, and of course the most recent one in 2014. What is similar to the Philippine case, what I want to stress here as an alternative explanation, is the alienation of these elite strategic groups. Of course, in Thailand, different groups, the monarchy, but as in the Philippines, civil society, trying to encourage the rule by good people and going against the electoral will of the masses. The ignorant masses are easily bribed and are basically not to be taken seriously by enlightened elites, and that's an opinion that's widespread both in Thailand and the Philippines. There's a worry about populist policies, and of course the electoral lock on power that Thaksin had. Estrada's was actually less. Estrada's popularity was not as massive as Thaksin's. He didn't come up with a kind of red shirt movement. Actually, his threats to the elites were less. So viewed from this perspective, the threat that Thaksin posed, and therefore the instability that this caused in the political system, was greater, and it had nothing whatsoever to do with presidentialism because it occurred within a parliamentary system. Here I see the common element, and I know there are alternative explanations that are important, is the class-based support that Thaksin drew on. People will point to the importance of regional cleavages, city-countryside cleavages, and so on. I would say, yes, that's true, but they do overlap powerfully with class cleavages and are not cross-cut, as in the Indonesian case, which is quite a different one, where religious affiliation and how that affects voting behavior, or regional elements and so on, don't easily reinforce class elements, in fact, often cross-cut. Therefore, the common argument, or the common element here, is the loss of support of these strategic groups. The neo-traditionalist groups, this would be the church, the Catholic Church hierarchy in the Philippines, the monarchy in Thailand, the military, civil society groups, and big business. The stability of Indonesia. I'll just say something very briefly because we'll be hearing much more this afternoon in our second session. Except, of course, for the removal of Wahid, which was done constitutionally, but it did create a bit of instability in 2001. It's been quite striking how, at least at the procedural level, Indonesian democracy has been quite, has operated quite smoothly. Here, again, I would agree to the fact that we can make arguments about Jokowi's arrangements with supposed opponents. We'll hear more about that this afternoon. We'll hear about the party system. These elements are all important. But again, I would say it's interesting how key strategic groups in Indonesia, we can discuss about how they best might be divided, how they basically line up behind the electoral system. And none of these groups have mounted a major challenge to it because arguably they've not felt threatened by it. The system has functioned thus that they haven't felt that there's a politician with electoral hold-on power who's a threat to their interest. And one of the key reasons, just to make the argument very simplistically here, I realize it has to be developed further, is limited class-based electoral appeals that occur in Indonesia. You have appeals that cross-cut these very dangerous class cleavages, as you see in Thailand and the Philippines in terms of political stability. So let me talk a little bit about these strategic groups. I would argue that politicians reign in these three Southeast Asian countries, but the actual rule is by these non-electoral elite strategic groups. As I said, they're powerful neo-traditionalist communal elites, possessors of nationalist and religious authority. Dan Slater was mentioned by Bill earlier, wrote an article about this in 2009. I've talked about the Catholic Church, the monarchy, Islamic leaders, monarchy in Thailand, Islamic leaders in Indonesia. Other key strategic groups, big business, civil society, and obviously the military. Although it's an interesting point about the military, in Praetorian-like situations, as Huntington famously argued, clubs are trumps. The military has the last word. Of course, that's true, but it's often these other strategic groups that stir the pot first, that create the instability that allow the military to move in more easily. And we saw that, for example, with the protests 2013-14 in Thailand. There's collaboration, there's collusion between these elites, but the military is often hesitant to step in until things are quite unstable. So what determines elites' attitudes toward elected governments, I would argue, is whether they feel their interests, their class interests, are adequately protected. And in situations where they don't feel such challenges, they're likely to be more tolerant of such an electoral democratic arrangement, whether it be presidential or parliamentary. So the many social cleavages that exist in all countries, I, of course, would say that that's important, and then I wouldn't deny the importance of all these other kinds of cleavages, as I mentioned, regional, countryside, city, and so on. But in Indonesia, much more than in the Philippines and Thailand, which besides the Muslim minority in the south, and of course some important regional differences in the case of Thailand between the north and south, basically in Indonesia you find interestingly how religion, particularly the attitude toward your attitude toward the way Islam should affect your voting behavior tends to cross-cut class. Obviously I'll need to talk more about that in the discussion if there are questions, and that will also be something that we'll perhaps have a chance to discuss this afternoon. Finally, what is most destabilizing in the Philippine case and the Thai case, regardless of their different institutional systems, was the populist challenge. Estrada came first in 1998, Thompson in 2001. They basically both upended existing political systems which had been supported by strategic groups. These were, interestingly, both yellows. In the case of the Philippines, the pro-Aquino forces are yellow because when Benigno Aquino was coming back to the Philippines, when he was actually assassinated, of course, in 1983, they were tying a yellow ribbon around the old oak tree, that old song, and of course the monarchy, the pro-monarchy forces using the color yellow in Thailand. When the elite forces were unable to defeat Estrada through legislative impeachment, or tax in the case of Thailand in elections, they resorted to extra electoral mobilization, dressed up as people power, but actually in both cases they were people power coups. So just to conclude, I would argue the imperiled presidencies of Estrada and Arroyo were not primarily due to the presidential systems, but the hostility of strategic groups. The unity of these groups led to the overthrow of Estrada. They were divided among Arroyo. That's actually why she could survive. The united parliamentary system of Thailand didn't prevent strategic groups from upending it. And the divided presidential system of Indonesia is stable. Therefore, I would argue the strategic groups are the most effective alternative explanation.